The silver spoons clinked against bone china teacups like funeral bells, as 100 of California's most powerful plantation owners gathered for their annual harvest celebration. Within 7 days, every last one of them would be convulsing in their final moments. This is the story of how one enslaved woman brought the entire Central Valley's cotton empire to its knees, with nothing more than patience, oleander, and a traveling medicine show. From the sprawling estates of Fresno to the grand haciendas of Bakersfield, the most ruthless men in 1852 California controlled thousands of acres and countless lives. They called themselves the Cotton Kings, ruling their domains with whips, chains, and the absolute certainty that their power was unshakable. But they had never encountered someone like Kyla Veyral. In just one macabre week in September 1852, she would systematically eliminate an entire generation of plantation masters, leaving their empires in ashes and their names carved in infamy. Before we dive into this dark chapter of Western history, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Kyla Veyral stood in the dusty courtyard of the Goldrich Trading Post, watching the last wagon of the traveling medicine show disappear into the California twilight of September 15, 1852. Behind her, scattered across 50 miles of Central Valley cotton plantations, the most powerful men in California were beginning to feel the first stirrings of nausea that would claim their lives within the week. The evening air carried the scent of cotton blossoms and something else, the faint bitter aroma of oleander that no one at the grand harvest celebration could yet identify. Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood's miracle elixir had been the hit of the annual Cotton Kings gathering, with every plantation master demanding bottles for their estates. They had no way of knowing that each amber bottle contained enough concentrated oleander extract to kill a dozen men. The harvest celebration had been Kyla's masterwork, 3 years in the planning. As the supposed assistant to the traveling medicine show, she had gained access to every major plantation in the Central Valley, studying routines, mapping properties, and most importantly, learning the names and faces of every man who profited from human bondage. Tonight, in mansions from Stockton to Bakersfield, cotton barons would drink their evening whiskey mixed with Dr. Blackwood's elixir, believing they were protecting themselves against the cholera outbreaks that had been sweeping through California. Instead, they were consuming their own deaths, one carefully measured drop at a time. The sun dipped below the Sierra Nevada mountains, painting the sky the color of dried blood. In the distance, smoke rose from the chimneys of plantation houses where families gathered for supper, unaware that their patriarchs had just begun the final week of their lives. Kyla pulled her shawl tighter and began walking toward the hills, where a network of abolitionists waited to spirit her away from the devastation she had orchestrated. But first, she had to survive the next 7 days. Because once the poisoning symptoms became undeniable, every lawman in California would be hunting for the woman who had single-handedly brought down the Cotton King's empire. The real Dr. Blackwood lay buried in a shallow grave 30 miles north, his credentials and medicine wagon now serving a very different purpose. Kyla had spent months learning his trade, perfecting his accent, memorizing his sales techniques. The transformation had been complete enough to fool men who had known the real doctor for years. As night fell over the Central Valley, she could almost hear the distant sounds of celebration from plantation houses, where masters raised toasts to the successful harvest season. They had no idea they were drinking to their own demise, or that the quiet woman who had sold them their medicine was the daughter of parents murdered by their overseer's whip. The first phase of her plan was complete. Now came the most dangerous part: staying alive long enough to see justice served on silver platters across 50 miles of cotton fields. The Central Valley of California in 1852 stretched like a golden basin between mountain ranges, its fertile soil dark with promise and soaked with the blood of those who worked it. Cotton plantations dotted the landscape like white-crowned kingdoms, each one a monument to human cruelty disguised as agricultural prosperity. Kyla Veyral had been born into this world of contradictions, where the same hands that picked cotton could mix poison with surgical precision. At 24, she possessed the kind of beauty that made plantation masters take notice and the intelligence to make them pay for their attention. Her mother, Callista Norwin, had been a house servant on the Thornfield estate before her death 5 years earlier. Her father, a freed black man named Josiah Veyral, had tried to purchase his wife's freedom but found himself sold into bondage instead when he couldn't meet the ever-increasing price. The Thornfield Plantation, owned by Kyla Veyral, sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Central Valley land. Veyral had built his fortune on cotton and maintained it through methods that made even hardened overseers uncomfortable. His annual harvest celebration brought together the 100 most powerful plantation owners in California, men who controlled the labor of 15,000 enslaved people and considered themselves the architects of California's agricultural future. These were the Cotton Kings, a loose confederation of plantation owners who met annually to discuss prices, share labor management techniques, and coordinate their political influence. Names like Aaron Crestvale, Elias Varick, and Elwayne Dreelan commanded respect in Sacramento and fear in the quarters where enslaved families huddled after 16-hour workdays. Kyla had grown up watching these men from the shadows of the big house, learning their routines, their weaknesses, their absolute certainty that their power was eternal. She observed how they treated their human property like livestock, separating families at will, using violence as casually as most people used salt to season food. The real Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood had been a traveling medicine man who made regular circuits through the Central Valley, selling everything from tooth powder to consumption cures. A thin, nervous man with pale eyes and shaking hands, he had made the fatal mistake of trying to assault Kyla during his last visit to the Thornfield Plantation. She had defended herself with a kitchen knife, and when he died from the wound, she realized she had been handed an opportunity disguised as a crisis. For 3 months, she had studied his medicines, practiced his mannerisms, and perfected the art of becoming someone else entirely. The transformation required more than costume changes. It demanded a complete reconstruction of personality, voice, and bearing. She learned to walk like a man carrying the weight of fraudulent medical knowledge, to speak with the confidence of someone selling hope in amber bottles. The Central Valley's isolation worked in her favor. Settlements were scattered, communication was slow, and people were desperate enough for medical attention that they rarely questioned a doctor's credentials too closely. By the time she appeared at the annual Cotton Kings celebration, she had become Dr. Blackwood so completely that even men who had met the original barely noticed the difference. The celebration itself was held at Veyral's mansion, a sprawling adobe structure that housed not only the plantation owner's family, but also served as an informal courthouse where the Cotton Kings conducted their business. Over 3 days, they would discuss cotton prices, coordinate shipping arrangements, and plan their collective response to the growing abolitionist movement that threatened their way of life. But this year's celebration would be different. This year, Kyla had come bearing gifts that would ensure none of these men lived to see another harvest season. The plantation house buzzed with activity as servants prepared for the arrival of guests from across the Central Valley. Chinese laborers who had stayed after completing railroad work tended the gardens. Mexican vaqueros managed the livestock, and enslaved people from the American South worked the cotton fields under the supervision of overseers who considered brutality a professional requirement. It was a powder keg of racial tensions and economic exploitation, held together by the absolute power of men who believed their wealth made them untouchable. Kyla moved through this world like a ghost made flesh, invisible until the moment she chose to reveal herself as the angel of death their sins had summoned. The memory that drove Kyla Veyral to orchestrate the largest mass poisoning in California history began on a February morning in 1847, when she was 19 years old and still believed that goodness might be rewarded in this world. Ichul dies. Her mother, Callista Norwin, had been discovered teaching letters to field hands in the abandoned smokehouse behind the quarters. The lessons had been going on for 2 years, conducted by candlelight after the exhausting cotton workdays ended. Callista used charcoal on barnwood to show enslaved men and women how to write their own names, how to read the passes that might mean the difference between freedom and capture. Arendor Valcrest found out when a house servant, hoping to curry favor, reported the secret school. The punishment was swift and designed to serve as an example to anyone else who might confuse education with insurrection. Kyla had been forced to watch as her mother was tied to the whipping post in the plantation's main courtyard. Valcrest himself administered the 50 lashes, each one designed to destroy not just flesh but spirit. By the 20th stroke, Callista was unconscious. By the 40th, her back looked like raw meat. At 50, she was no longer breathing. But Valcrest wasn't finished. He ordered Callista's body to remain tied to the post for 3 days, a warning to anyone else who might think education was worth dying for. Kyla was forbidden from cutting her mother down, forced to watch carrion birds and insects feast on the woman who had taught her that knowledge was power. Her father, Josiah Veyral, had tried to intervene. A freed man who worked as a blacksmith in the nearby town of Millerville, he had saved money for 3 years to purchase his wife's freedom. But when he arrived at the plantation with the required sum, Valcrest had smiled and doubled the price, then tripled it, then declared that Josiah himself would work off the debt. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Within a week, the man who had earned his freedom through years of labor found himself back in chains, his free papers burned, his life story rewritten to suit Valcrest's needs. The law, such as it existed in 1847 California, offered no protection for a black man whose word conflicted with a white plantation owner's version of events. Josiah lasted 8 months before dying of what the plantation doctor called exhaustion. Kyla knew better. She had seen the light fade from her father's eyes as he realized that all his years of hard work and careful saving had been meaningless in the face of absolute power backed by law. The deaths of her parents taught Kyla that the system could not be reformed, only destroyed. But destruction required patience, planning, and, most importantly, the kind of intimate knowledge that could only be gained by becoming invisible in plain sight. For 5 years, she played the part of the broken, grieving servant. She worked in the plantation house's kitchen, learning the rhythms of domestic life among California's agricultural elite. She listened to conversations between plantation owners, memorizing names, relationships, and the intricate web of business connections that bound the Cotton Kings together. During this time, she also learned about poison. It began innocently enough. She was assigned to help the plantation's doctor treat various ailments among the enslaved population. Dr. Marcus Tharvin was a drunk who cared more about his whiskey than his patients, but his medical books contained information about plant toxins, dosage calculations, and the symptoms of various forms of poisoning. Kyla taught herself to read using these medical texts, cross-referencing symptoms with the plants that grew wild throughout the Central Valley. She learned that oleander, which grew in decorative hedges around most plantation houses, contained cardiac glycosides that could stop a heart with remarkable efficiency. She discovered that the difference between medicine and poison was often just a matter of dosage and timing. The breakthrough came when she realized that California's isolation worked against the plantation owners as much as it worked for them. The same geographic barriers that protected them from outside interference also meant that a traveling medicine show could move between plantations without much oversight. If she could become the medicine man, she could gain access to every plantation in the Central Valley. Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood's death had been unplanned, but Kyla recognized opportunity when it presented itself. She spent 3 months studying his methods, practicing his voice, and perfecting the art of confidence-based medicine that kept desperate people buying whatever hope came in bottles. But the real genius of her plan lay in understanding the Cotton Kings' own psychology. These were men who believed their wealth made them immortal, who were so convinced of their own superiority that they would never suspect that the quiet servant they had once watched grieve her parents, death had transformed herself into their executioner. They had created the monster that would destroy them, shaping her through loss until patience became her greatest weapon and justice, her only remaining purpose. The Cotton Kings' annual harvest celebration began at dawn on September 12, 1852, with the arrival of carriages and wagons from plantations across the Central Valley. Kyla, now thoroughly transformed into Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood, set up her medicine wagon in the courtyard of Valcrest's plantation house, displaying bottles of elixirs that promised everything from increased virility to protection against cholera. The timing was perfect. California had been gripped by fear of cholera outbreaks spreading from San Francisco, and these powerful men were desperate for any protection that money could buy. Dr. Blackwood's miracle elixir, with its impressive amber color and carefully crafted medicinal smell, represented exactly the kind of exclusive treatment that appealed to their sense of superiority. Kyla had spent months perfecting the elixir's formulation. The base consisted of sugar water, alcohol, and bitter herbs that masked the taste of the oleander extract she had been concentrating for over a year. Each bottle contained enough poison to kill 12 men, but she had calculated the dosage to work slowly, allowing victims to return to their plantations before symptoms became severe. The key to the plan's success lay in understanding the Cotton Kings, social hierarchy, and business relationships. These men didn't just own plantations. They formed an interconnected network of partnerships, marriages, and financial arrangements that bound them together like a spider's web. If she could poison the core group, their deaths would trigger a cascade of investigations, property disputes, and power struggles that would paralyze the entire system. Arendtor Valcrest, as the host and unofficial leader of the Cotton Kings, was her primary target. But surrounding him were men like Aaron Crestvale, who controlled shipping contracts that moved cotton from California to eastern markets. Elias Varick managed the banking relationships that financed plantation expansions. Elwayne Drellin coordinated with Mexican landowners who supplied seasonal labor. Each man represented a different piece of the machine that kept human bondage profitable in California. Remove enough pieces, and the entire mechanism would collapse. The first day of the celebration focused on business meetings, with plantation owners discussing cotton prices, labor costs, and their collective response to increasing abolitionist pressure from Washington. Kyla moved among them as Dr. Blackwood, offering free consultations and building trust through carefully researched medical knowledge. She had studied each man's health concerns by questioning their house servants during previous visits. Valcrest suffered from gout. Crestvale worried about heart palpitations. Varick complained of digestive problems. She tailored her sales approach to each individual's fears, making the elixir seem like a personalized solution to their specific ailments. The cholera outbreak in San Francisco has officials worried. She told groups of gathered plantation owners, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had supposedly seen the disease's effects firsthand. The symptoms begin subtly: nausea, weakness, irregular heartbeat. By the time most people recognize the danger, it's too late for treatment. The irony was that she was accurately describing oleander poisoning while claiming to prevent cholera. The symptoms would begin within days of consumption, but by then, each man would be back on his own plantation, far from medical help and surrounded by people who had every reason to let him die slowly. The second day brought the celebration's social events, with an elaborate feast featuring delicacies imported from San Francisco and Mexico. Kyla used the dinner as an opportunity to observe her targets, eating and drinking habits, noting who consumed alcohol heavily, who preferred sweet flavors, and who might be most likely to take medicine regularly. During the evening's entertainment, which featured musicians and dancers brought in from Los Angeles, she privately consulted with individual plantation owners, reinforcing their fears about cholera while subtly suggesting that the elixir worked best when taken daily for at least a week. Prevention requires consistency, she explained to Alvin Crestvale, Aaron's younger brother who had inherited a smaller plantation near Fresno. One dose might protect you for a day, but sustained protection requires sustained treatment. The third and final day of the celebration was when Kyla made her move. During the morning business session, she announced that she had received word of confirmed cholera cases in Sacramento, creating a sense of urgency that made her elixir seem like a necessity rather than a luxury. The sales session turned into a feeding frenzy. Plantation owners competed to purchase bottles for their families, their overseers, and their most valuable human property. Some ordered cases to be shipped to business partners in other parts of California. Others demanded exclusive formulations that would give them access to protection unavailable to their competitors. Kyla had prepared for this moment by creating different concentrations of poison for different targets. The most dangerous men received the strongest doses, while lesser plantation owners got weaker formulations that would cause illness but not death. The goal was to create confusion about the source of the outbreak, while ensuring that the true power brokers would not survive to organize a response. By noon on September 15th, she had sold 127 bottles of poisoned elixir to 84 different plantation owners and their associates. Each bottle was labeled with careful instructions about dosage and timing, ensuring that the maximum number of men would consume lethal amounts within the first week after the celebration. As the Cotton Kings departed for their respective plantations, each carrying cases of amber bottles that represented their doom, Kyla began her own preparations for departure. She had arranged for the medicine wagon to be abandoned at a predetermined location, where abolitionists would destroy all evidence of its existence. Her transformation back to invisibility required careful attention to detail. Dr. Blackwood's clothes would be buried, his medical equipment scattered, his identity dissolved like sugar in water. But first, she had to reach the safety of the underground network that would carry her away from the devastation she had orchestrated. The real test would come in the following days, as symptoms began to manifest across the Central Valley. Her success would be measured not just in deaths, but in the complete breakdown of the system that had murdered her parents and destroyed countless other families. As she drove the medicine wagon away from Valcrest's plantation for the final time, Kyla allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The Cotton Kings had built their empire on the belief that some people were property and others were masters. Within a week, they would discover that death was the ultimate equalizer, recognizing no distinction between owner and owned. The first symptoms appeared on September 18th, 3 days after the harvest celebration ended. Arendor Valcrest woke before dawn with nausea so severe he couldn't stand without vomiting. His wife, Jasmine Orville, found him collapsed in his study, surrounded by financial ledgers and empty bottles of Dr. Blackwood's elixir. 50 miles away, Aaron Crestvale was experiencing similar distress. The shipping magnate had been taking the elixir twice daily, convinced that his heart palpitations indicated the early stages of cholera. By morning, his heart was beating so irregularly that his wife, Elia Vorick, sent their fastest rider to fetch the nearest doctor. But doctors were already overwhelmed. Across the Central Valley, the same scene was playing out in plantation houses from Stockton to Bakersfield. Men who had been healthy and vigorous just days before were now writhing in agony, their bodies betraying them in ways that defied medical explanation. Dr. Rowett Calvane, who served the northern plantations, found himself riding from estate to estate, treating symptoms that seemed to shift and evolve even as he watched. The initial nausea and vomiting gave way to severe abdominal pain, followed by confusion and heart irregularities that suggested systemic poisoning. What did they eat? He asked plantation wives and overseers, but the answers were frustratingly inconsistent. Different households had served different meals, purchased supplies from different sources, followed different routines. The only common element was Dr. Blackwood's elixir, but that was supposed to prevent illness, not cause it. By September 20th, the first deaths began. Elias Varick died in his sleep after 2 days of steadily worsening symptoms. His wife, Maeva Linthorne, found him cold and still in their bed, his face twisted in a final expression of confused agony. The news spread through the plantation network like wildfire. If Varick, one of the most powerful bankers in California, could die so suddenly, no one was safe. Plantation owners who had been dismissing their symptoms as temporary illness now faced the terrifying reality that something was systematically destroying their community. Panic set in when Elwayne Draylen collapsed during a business meeting in Fresno. The labor coordinator had been negotiating contracts with Mexican suppliers when he suddenly doubled over, clutching his chest and gasping for air. He died within hours, witnessed by a dozen business associates who spread word of his dramatic final moments. By September 22nd, 7 of the Cotton Kings were dead, and another 20 were showing severe symptoms. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Every victim had attended the harvest celebration, and every victim had purchased Dr. Blackwood's elixir. But Dr. Blackwood had vanished as completely as morning mist. His medicine wagon was found abandoned near the town of Millerville, stripped of everything valuable and showing no signs of where its owner might have gone. Local residents claimed no knowledge of the traveling medicine man, and records of his supposed medical credentials proved impossible to verify. Arendor Valcrest, despite his own severe illness, tried to coordinate a response from his plantation house. He sent riders to every major settlement in California, offering rewards for information about Dr. Blackwood's whereabouts. But the man seemed to have dissolved into the landscape, leaving behind only death and confusion. The investigation revealed the horrifying scope of the poisoning. Dr. Blackwood hadn't just sold elixir to the primary plantation owners. He had also supplied bottles to their family members, business partners, overseers, and trusted servants. The poison was spreading through the upper echelons of Central Valley society like a plague designed specifically for the wealthy and powerful. Alvin Crestvale died on September 23rd, followed within hours by his neighbor Marcus Tharvin, who had purchased elixir for his entire family. Plantation wives found themselves widowed overnight, their children suddenly orphaned, their entire world structure collapsing as the men who had seemed invincible proved as mortal as anyone else. The enslaved population watched these developments with carefully hidden emotions. Some felt satisfaction at seeing their oppressors suffer, while others worried about what would happen when the current power structure completely collapsed. Without clear leadership, the plantations could dissolve into chaos that might be even more dangerous than the current system. But Kyla had anticipated this concern. Before disappearing, she had quietly spread word through the underground network that this was a targeted action against specific individuals, not a general war against all white people. The goal was liberation, not massacre. As the death toll mounted, reaching 30 by September 24th, territorial authorities finally arrived from Sacramento to investigate. Federal marshals found plantations in varying states of disorder, with some managed by grieving widows, others by panicked overseers, and a few completely abandoned as entire families succumbed to the mysterious illness. The political implications were staggering. The Cotton Kings had represented California's most powerful agricultural interests, men whose influence reached into territorial government and national politics. Their sudden deaths created a power vacuum that would reshape California's economy and social structure. Newspapers in San Francisco and Los Angeles initially reported the deaths as a cholera outbreak, but medical investigators quickly determined that the symptoms didn't match any known disease. The pattern was too specific, too targeted, and too perfectly timed to be natural. By September 25th, 47 plantation owners were dead, with another 30 showing severe symptoms that suggested they would not survive much longer. The elixir bottles found in their homes all contained the same amber liquid, but laboratory analysis revealed the presence of cardiac glycosides consistent with oleander poisoning. The realization that someone had deliberately poisoned nearly 100 of California's most powerful men sent shockwaves through the territorial government. This wasn't random violence or even political assassination. It was systematic extermination carried out with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of the victims, routines, and relationships. As the week progressed, the death toll continued to climb. Rawat Calvain, the doctor who had tried desperately to save his patients, died on September 26th after consuming elixir he had purchased for his own protection. His death eliminated one of the few medical professionals who might have identified the poison's source earlier in the outbreak. By September 27th, the body count reached 63, with no sign that the deaths would stop. The surviving plantation owners faced a terrible choice: continue taking the elixir they had already purchased, risking death if it was indeed poisoned, or stop the treatment and face potential cholera infection if the medicine was legitimate. Most chose to stop, but for many it was already too late. The oleander extract continued working in their systems, causing heart failures and organ shutdowns that no amount of medical intervention could prevent. The Cotton Kings' empire was collapsing one funeral at a time, and somewhere in the California hills, Kyla Veyral was counting each death as a payment toward the debt owed for her parents' murders. Federal Marshal William Asherton arrived in the Central Valley on September 28th to find a territory in complete chaos. The man who had built his reputation tracking down gold rush criminals and border raiders now faced something unprecedented in his 20-year career: the systematic elimination of an entire social class through what appeared to be the most sophisticated poisoning operation in American history. The scene at Arendor Valcrest's plantation told the story in stark detail. The mansion that had hosted California's most powerful agricultural summit just 2 weeks earlier now resembled a morgue draped in expensive fabric. Valcrest himself lay in the master bedroom, his body contorted in the final agony of cardiac arrest, while bottles of Dr. Blackwood's elixir sat on his nightstand like evidence of trust betrayed. Asherton's first challenge was simply establishing the scope of the disaster. Communication between plantations had always been slow, but now it was completely disrupted. Many of the men who had served as informal leaders and message carriers were either dead or dying, leaving their properties in the hands of widows, children, and overseers who lacked both authority and information. The marshal's preliminary count revealed 68 confirmed deaths, with another 32 men showing symptoms severe enough that recovery seemed unlikely. But these numbers only reflected the primary targets. The poison had spread beyond the original Cotton Kings to include family members, business partners, and trusted associates who had received bottles as gifts or purchased them based on recommendations. Dr. Sarah Martinez, one of the few physicians in California with formal medical training, had been summoned from San Francisco to assist with the investigation. Her examination of the victims revealed a pattern of organ failure consistent with cardiac glycoside poisoning, most likely from oleander extract. But the sophistication of the delivery method suggested knowledge that went far beyond folk remedies or accidental contamination. This wasn't random. Dr. Martinez explained to Marshall Asherton as they stood in Vallecrest's study, surrounded by financial records and correspondence that painted a picture of the dead man's vast business empire. The concentration of poison in each bottle was carefully calibrated. Some victims received doses that killed within days. Others got weaker formulations that caused prolonged suffering. Someone wanted these men to die, but they also wanted them to die slowly enough to spread fear throughout the community. The investigation quickly focused on Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood, whose medicine wagon had been found abandoned but thoroughly cleaned. Local residents in Millerville claimed the wagon had appeared overnight and disappeared just as suddenly, with no witnesses to its arrival or the departure of its owner. But the thoroughness of the cleanup suggested professional expertise rather than panicked flight. When Asherton finally located people who remembered the real Dr. Blackwood, the mystery deepened. The traveling medicine man had been a thin, nervous individual with pale skin and a persistent cough. But witnesses from the harvest celebration described someone entirely different. A confident, robust figure who moved with authority and spoke with medical knowledge that impressed even educated plantation owners. It was like someone had studied the doctor so completely they became him, explained Erixie Marvain, widow of plantation owner James Marvain, as she sat in her parlor surrounded by bottles of the poisoned elixir. But there was something in the eyes, something that made me uncomfortable. I thought it was just the strain of dealing with all the cholera fears, but now I wonder if I was seeing something else entirely. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered the real Dr. Blackwood's body in a shallow grave 30 miles north of the Vallecrest plantation. The corpse showed signs of violent death, with knife wounds that suggested close-quarters combat rather than random robbery. More importantly, the burial showed signs of careful planning, with the body wrapped in materials that would accelerate decomposition and hidden in a location that might never have been found without systematic searching. Someone killed Dr. Blackwood and took his place, Marshall Asherton concluded during a meeting with territorial officials in Sacramento. They studied his methods, his appearance, his entire identity well enough to fool people who had known him for years. This wasn't impulse or opportunity. This was a years-long plan executed by someone with access to medical knowledge, chemical expertise, and detailed information about plantation society. The social implications of the massacre were becoming clear as investigators interviewed surviving family members and business associates. The Cotton Kings hadn't just been wealthy individuals. They had formed an interconnected network that controlled California's agricultural economy, influenced territorial politics, and maintained the system of forced labor that made their prosperity possible. With their leadership eliminated, the plantations were struggling to maintain basic operations. Some properties had been abandoned entirely as families fled in fear of further poisoning. Others were being managed by widows who lacked the social connections or business knowledge to maintain complex agricultural operations. Several had already seen their enslaved populations disappear into the countryside, taking advantage of the chaos to seek freedom. Thessa Orvind, whose husband Garrett had died on September 24th, found herself trying to manage a 3,000-acre cotton plantation with only her teenage son and a handful of overseers who seemed more interested in looting than leadership. "They're waiting for us to fail," she told investigators, referring to the enslaved people who had once seemed completely under control. "They smell weakness, and they're preparing to take advantage of it." But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators realized that the poisoner had demonstrated intimate knowledge of plantation society's internal dynamics. The strongest poison concentrations had gone to the most powerful and brutal plantation owners, while lesser figures received weaker doses that caused illness but not death. Some bottles had been diluted enough to cause only minor symptoms, suggesting the poisoner had made moral distinctions about which victims deserved death and which deserved merely suffering. This level of discrimination required detailed knowledge about individual plantation owners, reputations, business practices, and treatment of their human property. The investigation team began to suspect that the poisoner wasn't a random criminal but someone with personal connections to the plantation system, possibly someone who had lived and worked within it. The search for suspects focused initially on disgruntled overseers, dismissed servants, and freed blacks who might have harbored resentment against the plantation system. But none of these categories seemed to fit the profile emerging from the evidence. The poisoner had medical knowledge, chemical expertise, acting ability, and the social skills necessary to convince sophisticated businessmen to purchase poison disguised as medicine. Marshal Asherton's investigation team interviewed hundreds of people across the Central Valley, but the questioning revealed more about the poisoner's careful preparation than about their identity. Witnesses remembered Dr. Blackwood visiting plantations for months before the harvest celebration, always professional, always knowledgeable, always somehow forgettable despite his obvious expertise. "It's like they were building a ghost," Asherton told his deputies during one of their evening briefings. Someone who could move through plantation society without leaving permanent impressions, who could gain trust without forming lasting relationships. They knew exactly how long they could maintain the deception and exactly when they needed to disappear. The investigation also revealed the broader impact of the poisoning on California's economy and politics. The Cotton Kings had controlled shipping contracts, banking relationships, and political influence that reached into territorial government and national politics. Their sudden deaths had created a power vacuum that was already being filled by less experienced and potentially less stable individuals. Some observers worried that the elimination of the plantation system's leadership might lead to even greater violence as competing groups struggled for control. Others hoped that the disruption might create opportunities for reforming or eliminating forced labor in California. But everyone agreed that the poisoning had fundamentally altered the territory's social and economic structure in ways that would take years to fully understand. By October 1st, the death toll had reached 84, with another 16 men showing symptoms that suggested they would not survive much longer. The investigation had identified Dr. Blackwood as the delivery mechanism, but had made little progress in determining who had murdered the real doctor and assumed his identity. The poisoner's trail seemed to end at the abandoned medicine wagon, as if the perpetrator had simply vanished into the California landscape, but Marshal Asherton suspected that someone with this level of planning ability wouldn't disappear randomly. They would have prepared an escape route as carefully as they had prepared the poisoning itself, probably with help from accomplices who shared their hatred of the plantation system. The search was expanding beyond California's borders, with inquiries sent to law enforcement agencies in Oregon, Nevada, and Mexico. But Asherton knew that finding the poisoner would require more than systematic searching. It would require understanding the kind of personal motivation that could drive someone to plan and execute such an elaborate revenge scheme. As October began, the investigation was still gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses, but the trail was growing colder with each passing day. The poisoner had demonstrated patience, intelligence, and ruthless efficiency that suggested they were already far from California, possibly building a new identity as carefully as they had constructed Dr. Blackwood's persona. The Cotton King's empire was dead, their leadership eliminated with surgical precision, and their killer had vanished as completely as morning mist in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The first major breakthrough in the manhunt came from an unexpected source. Evelyn Carowin, a seamstress in the small town of Angels Camp, approached Marshal Asherton on October 3rd with information that would reshape the entire investigation. She had been mending clothes for a woman calling herself Sarah Coleman, a supposed widow traveling north to join family in Oregon. But something about the woman's behavior had struck Carowin as suspicious. "She paid me in gold coin, which was strange enough," Carowin explained as she sat in the marshal's temporary headquarters in Stockton. "But what really caught my attention was how she handled the needle and thread. Her fingers moved like someone who'd done fine detail work for years, not the clumsy stitching you'd expect from a farm widow. And there were stains on her fingertips, dark stains that looked like they came from handling herbs or medicines. More importantly, Carowin had noticed that the woman carried herself differently when she thought no one was watching. When people were around, she walked hunched over like she was carrying grief, but when she was alone in my shop, standing by the window, her posture was straight and confident, like someone who'd never been broken by anything." The description matched reports from other towns along the route toward Oregon, where a woman traveling alone had purchased supplies, always paying in gold, always maintaining the story about joining family in the north. But investigators were beginning to notice inconsistencies in the details. In some towns, she claimed to be from Missouri. In others, she said Kansas. The family she was supposedly joining changed names and relationships depending on who was asking. Marshall Asherton assembled a pursuit team that included two of California's most experienced trackers, both men who had learned their skills chasing Army deserters and gold rush claim jumpers through some of the roughest terrain in the American West. But they quickly discovered that their quarry possessed skills that rivaled their own. The trail led north through the Central Valley, then west toward the coast, then doubled back toward the Sierra Nevada mountains in a pattern that suggested someone deliberately creating confusion about their ultimate destination. At each turn, the woman had made choices that indicated detailed knowledge of California's geography and an understanding of how to move through the landscape without leaving clear tracks. "She's not running randomly," concluded Jake Thornton, the senior tracker, as he studied a map marked with confirmed sightings. "This is someone who planned escape routes as carefully as they planned the poisoning. They're leading us in circles while they work their way toward whatever destination they really have in mind." The investigation took on new urgency when laboratory analysis of the poisoned elixir revealed additional disturbing details. Dr. Martinez's chemical examination showed that the oleander extract had been refined using techniques that required sophisticated knowledge of chemistry and access to specialized equipment. The poison wasn't something that could be prepared in a kitchen using folk remedies. It required the kind of laboratory setup that suggested formal medical or pharmaceutical training. Whoever did this understood not just which plants were poisonous, but how to extract and concentrate the active compounds, Dr. Martinez explained to the expanded investigation team. They knew how to mask the bitter taste, how to calculate dosages based on body weight and health conditions, and how to time the symptoms so that victims wouldn't connect their illness to the medicine until it was too late for treatment. This revelation led investigators to focus on people with connections to California's small but growing medical community. They interviewed every doctor, pharmacist, and medical apprentice they could locate, looking for someone with the necessary knowledge who had also disappeared around the time of the poisoning. But the search yielded no clear suspects, only the growing realization that they were dealing with someone whose expertise extended far beyond what any normal criminal investigation had prepared them to handle. The pursuit intensified when witnesses in Nevada reported seeing a woman matching their suspect's description crossing the border on October 8th. She had been traveling with a small wagon train of miners heading toward the Carson River silver strikes, using the identity of Martha Whitfield, a supposed nurse going to tend wounded men in the mining camps. Federal authorities in Nevada were alerted, and a coordinated search began across the territory's scattered mining settlements. But the woman seemed to stay one step ahead of every attempt to corner her, always moving just before authorities arrived, always leaving behind people who remembered her kindness and medical expertise, but could provide no useful information about her real identity or ultimate destination. The breakthrough came when investigators finally made the connection between the poisoner and the plantation system she had targeted. A careful review of plantation records revealed that Dr. Blackwood had made regular visits to Central Valley plantations for over a year before the harvest celebration, always maintaining the same professional demeanor but gradually gathering information about plantation owners, health concerns, family relationships, and business connections. But more importantly, witnesses who had worked on various plantations began to remember a house servant who had occasionally assisted during Dr. Blackwood's visits. She had been described as quiet, competent, and easily overlooked, someone who could handle medical supplies and ask intelligent questions without attracting attention to herself. The description matched staff records from the Valcrest plantation, where a woman named Kyla Veyral had worked as a house servant for several years before disappearing shortly after the harvest celebration. Interviews with other enslaved people who had known her revealed that she had taught herself to read using medical books, had shown unusual interest in plant medicines, and had been asking questions about chemistry and poison preparation for months before the celebration. She was always learning, explained Amira Solvane, a cook who had worked alongside Kyla in the Valcrest plantation house. But she was smart about hiding it, never asking too many questions at once, never letting anyone see how much she really knew. Looking back, I think she was studying all of us as much as she was studying those medical books. The revelation that their suspect was an enslaved woman who had somehow acquired advanced medical knowledge and transformed herself into a traveling medicine man forced investigators to completely revise their understanding of the case. This wasn't a random criminal or even a disgruntled former employee. This was someone who had lived within the plantation system, observed its weaknesses, and planned her revenge with the patience and precision of someone who understood that she would only get one chance. Marshall Asherton issued new wanted posters with Kyla Veyral's real description, but he knew that someone capable of completely transforming herself into Dr. Blackwood could probably change her appearance in ways that made previous descriptions useless. The investigation shifted focus from tracking a fleeing suspect to predicting where someone with her motivations and skills might be heading. The answer came from an unexpected analysis of the poisoning pattern itself. Dr. Martinez's review of the victims revealed that Kyla had made careful distinctions about who received fatal doses and who received weaker concentrations. The men who died quickly had been the most brutal plantation owners, those known for using extreme violence against their enslaved workers. The men who received weaker doses had been less directly involved in day-to-day plantation management. She wasn't just killing randomly, Dr. Martinez explained during a strategy meeting with federal authorities. She was making moral judgments about which victims deserved death and which deserved only suffering. That suggests someone who maintained ethical boundaries even while committing mass murder, someone who saw herself as administering justice rather than simply seeking revenge. This psychological profile led investigators to a disturbing conclusion. Kyla Veyral might not be finished. If she had researched California's plantation owners well enough to make fine distinctions about their guilt, she might have similar knowledge about plantation systems in other states. The poisoning of the Cotton Kings might not be an isolated incident, but the first phase of a larger campaign against slavery itself. Federal authorities expanded the investigation to include plantations in Oregon, Nevada, and even Texas, warning plantation owners to be suspicious of any traveling medicine men or medical practitioners they didn't know personally. But this created its own problems, as legitimate doctors found themselves facing suspicion and hostility from potential patients who had become paranoid about anyone offering medical treatment. The pursuit continued through October, with confirmed sightings in mining camps, frontier towns, and isolated settlements across the American West. But Kyla seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to disappear whenever authorities closed in. Some reports described her as a nurse treating injured miners. Others mentioned a school teacher working with immigrant families. Still others spoke of a seamstress helping travelers repair their clothes and equipment. Each identity was perfectly crafted for its environment, complete with appropriate skills, believable backstories, and personality traits that made her memorable for positive reasons while providing no useful information for investigators. She had become a master of hiding in plain sight, using people's expectations and prejudices to create invisibility that was more effective than any physical disguise. The investigation team began to suspect that Kyla had prepared multiple escape identities years in advance, probably with help from the Underground Railroad network that operated throughout the Western Territories. Her ability to move between communities and assume new roles suggested access to forged documents, safe houses, and a support system that treated her as a freedom fighter rather than a criminal. But the most frustrating aspect of the pursuit was that Kyla seemed to be helping people everywhere she went. Mining camp supervisors praised the nurse who had saved lives during a cave-in accident. Immigrant families spoke gratefully of the teacher who had helped their offspring learn English. Even law enforcement officers in some towns had positive memories of the helpful woman who had assisted with medical emergencies. "She's not just hiding," Marshall Asherton told his superiors in a report filed on October 20th. "She's building a legend. Every community she touches remembers her as someone who helped them, which means they're less likely to cooperate with authorities trying to capture her. She's turning her fugitive status into a form of protection." By the end of October, the trail had grown so cold that some investigators wondered if Kyla had died in the wilderness or found a way to leave the country entirely. But Marshall Asherton remained convinced that someone with her planning ability and moral conviction was still alive, still moving, and possibly still planning new attacks against the plantation system. The final confirmed sighting came from a trading post near the Oregon border, where a woman matching Kyla's description had purchased supplies for a journey into the Cascade Mountains. The trader remembered her because she had paid for medicine to treat a Native American family suffering from fever, demonstrating the same medical knowledge and humanitarian instincts that had characterized her other identities. After that, Kyla Veyral vanished completely into the American wilderness, leaving behind a trail of grateful communities, baffled investigators, and 100 dead plantation owners whose empire would never be rebuilt. The Cotton Kings were gone, their system destroyed, and their killer had disappeared as thoroughly as if she had never existed at all. 23 years later, in the autumn of 1875, a woman named Catherine Thornfield sat in the parlor of her modest home in Portland, Oregon, reading newspaper accounts of the California agricultural boom that had followed the Civil War. The article described how former plantation lands in the Central Valley had been divided into smaller farms worked by free laborers, many of them formerly enslaved people who had stayed in California after emancipation. Catherine was known throughout Portland as a dedicated nurse who had spent decades treating patients in logging camps, mining settlements, and immigrant communities across the Pacific Northwest. Her neighbors respected her medical knowledge, her willingness to treat anyone regardless of their ability to pay, and her quiet dignity in the face of personal tragedies that had shaped her into someone who understood suffering in ways that most people never would. But Catherine Thornfield had not always been her name, just as the gray-haired woman reading about California's transformation had not always been a respectable nurse in Oregon. The newspaper article mentioned the mysterious poisoning of the Cotton Kings in 1852, describing it as one of the unsolved mysteries that had marked California's transition from territory to statehood. The writer speculated about what had become of the elusive Dr. Blackwood, suggesting that the perpetrator had probably died in the wilderness or fled to Mexico. Catherine set the newspaper aside and walked to her bedroom, where she opened a wooden chest that contained the only reminders of her previous life. Inside lay a small bottle of amber glass, empty now but still faintly scented with the herbal mixture that had once disguised the taste of oleander extract. Beside it rested a faded photograph of two people she had learned to remember as strangers, Callista Norwin and Kyla Veyral, her parents, whose deaths had set in motion a chain of events that changed the course of California history. The chest also contained letters, dozens of them, written over the years by people whose lives had been touched by the collapse of the Cotton Kings' empire. Former enslaved people wrote to thank the mysterious figure who had eliminated their oppressors. Abolitionist organizations sent coded messages praising the unknown avenger who had struck such a decisive blow against the plantation system. Even some plantation owners, widows, had written, expressing gratitude that their husbands' deaths had freed them from marriages built on violence and exploitation. But the most treasured items in the chest were letters from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a Mexican physician who had helped Kyla establish her new identity in the months following her escape from California. Dr. Rodriguez had been part of a network of medical professionals who opposed slavery and were willing to help freedom fighters disappear into new lives. She had taught Kyla advanced nursing techniques, helped her forge credentials as a trained medical practitioner, and, most importantly, helped her understand that revenge could be transformed into healing if channeled properly. The transformation from Kyla Veyral to Catherine Thornfield had required more than new documents and a different appearance. It had demanded a complete reconstruction of purpose, moving from someone who killed oppressors to someone who saved lives. The process had taken years of internal struggle, as Kyla learned to channel the same precision and patience she had used for poisoning into the art of healing. Her first years in Oregon had been the most difficult. The knowledge that she had killed 100 men regardless of their crimes weighed on her conscience in ways she had not anticipated. Dr. Rodriguez had warned her that the psychological aftermath of such an extreme act of revenge could be as destructive as the revenge itself, but Kyla had been too focused on escape to consider the long-term emotional consequences. The guilt had manifested in nightmares where she saw the faces of her victims, not as the brutal plantation owners they had been, but as husbands and fathers whose deaths had left families devastated. She began to understand that justice and revenge, while sometimes overlapping, were not identical concepts. Justice sought to restore balance and prevent future harm, while revenge simply transferred pain from one person to another. It was this realization that led Kyla to dedicate her new life to healing rather than harming. As Catherine Thornfield, she became known for her ability to treat conditions that other medical practitioners found hopeless. Her knowledge of plant medicines, originally developed for poisoning, proved equally valuable for creating remedies that could save lives rather than end them. She specialized in treating victims of violence, people whose injuries reflected the same kind of systematic brutality she had witnessed on plantations, loggers maimed by unsafe working conditions, miners suffering from lung diseases caused by employer negligence. immigrant families dealing with malnutrition and disease because they couldn't afford proper medical care. Each patient became an opportunity to transform her knowledge of suffering into an instrument of healing. The irony was not lost on her that the same hands that had mixed oleander extract into medicine bottles now mixed genuine remedies that extended lives rather than ending them. The same patients that had allowed her to plan a 3-year revenge campaign now served her as she spent months treating patients whose conditions required long-term care and gradual healing. But Catherine also maintained connections to the broader struggle against oppression that had motivated her original actions. Her home served as a safe house for people fleeing various forms of persecution, from escaped slaves before the Civil War to Chinese immigrants facing violence in mining camps. Her medical practice provided cover for activities that would have been illegal if discovered by unsympathetic authorities. The letters in her chest documented a network of people who had been inspired by the Cotton King's poisoning to take their own actions against systematic oppression. Some had followed her example of using medical knowledge as a weapon, poisoning overseers and slave catchers in smaller-scale operations that never attracted the attention her spectacular massacre had received. Others had used the chaos following the poisoning to help enslaved people escape, taking advantage of the power vacuum to guide families to freedom. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of her actions was the psychological effect on the plantation system itself. News of the poisoning had spread far beyond California, creating paranoia among plantation owners throughout the American West and even into the traditional slave states. Many had dismissed their household servants, hired food tasters, or stopped employing traveling medical practitioners altogether. This paranoia had made the plantation system less efficient and more expensive to maintain, contributing to economic pressures that would eventually help bring about its collapse. The Cotton King's poisoning had demonstrated that the people plantation owners considered their property possessed the intelligence, patience, and capability to strike back in ways that threatened the entire system's stability. Catherine had followed the Civil War with intense interest, recognizing that the conflict represented the culmination of tensions that her actions had helped intensify. The Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment had accomplished legally what she had tried to achieve through violence: the destruction of slavery as an economic and social institution. But she also understood that the end of legal slavery had not eliminated the systematic oppression that had motivated her original revenge. New forms of exploitation had emerged to replace the old ones, and the struggle for true equality would require different tactics than the dramatic gesture she had employed against the Cotton Kings. As she aged, Catherine began to document her experiences, not for publication but for future generations who might face similar choices between justice and revenge. Her private writings explored the moral complexity of using violence against oppression, acknowledging both the satisfaction of seeing her parents, murderers, pay for their crimes, and the weight of carrying responsibility for so many deaths. The final entry in her journal, written shortly before her death in 1891, reflected on the legacy of her actions, with the wisdom that only comes from decades of reflection. I eliminated 100 men who profited from human bondage, and I do not regret their deaths, but I have spent the rest of my life trying to heal the damage that such systematic cruelty creates in both its victims and its perpetrators. Violence can destroy oppressive systems, but only healing can build better ones to replace them. When Catherine Thornfield died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 63, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched through her medical practice. Former patients spoke of her skill and compassion, immigrant families praised her willingness to treat them without payment, and community leaders remembered her decades of service to Portland's most vulnerable residents. None of them knew that they were burying the woman who had single-handedly brought down California's Cotton Kings, or that the gentle hands that had healed their wounds had once mixed poison with scientific precision. The secret died with her, buried along with the amber bottle and faded photographs that represented the only physical evidence of Kyla Veyral's transformation into Catherine Thornfield. But the legacy of her actions lived on in ways that extended far beyond the immediate destruction of the plantation system. The Cotton King's poisoning had become legend among communities fighting oppression, a reminder that systematic injustice could be challenged by individuals willing to sacrifice everything for the cause of freedom. In barbershops and churches throughout the American West, people still told stories about the mysterious figure who had eliminated 100 plantation owners in a single week, The details changed with each telling, but the core message remained constant. Those who profited from human suffering were not as untouchable as they believed, and justice, even when delayed, could be as inevitable as death itself. Some historians would later argue that the Cotton King's poisoning was one of the catalysts that helped bring about the Civil War, demonstrating that the conflict over slavery had reached a point where individuals were willing to commit mass murder rather than accept the continuation of human bondage. Others would dismiss it as an isolated incident that had little impact on broader historical trends. But in the communities where formerly enslaved people built new lives after emancipation, the story of Kyla Veyral served a different purpose. It reminded them that they had always possessed the intelligence, courage, and capability to fight back against their oppressors, even when the odds seemed impossible and the cost seemed unbearable. The amber bottle that had once contained death had been transformed into a symbol of the possibility that individual action, carefully planned and courageously executed, could change the course of history. And somewhere in the California Central Valley, where cotton fields had given way to diverse agriculture worked by free laborers, the wind still carried whispers of the woman who had turned medicine into justice and disappeared into legend. Dr. Patricia Hernandez pushed aside the dusty cardboard boxes that had been stored in the basement of Portland General Hospital for over a century. As the hospital's chief archivist, she had seen plenty of forgotten medical records. But something about these particular files had caught her attention during the 2019 renovation project. The boxes contained the personal effects of Catherine Thornfield, a nurse who had worked in Portland from 1852 until her death in 1891. According to hospital records, Thornfield had been one of the most skilled medical practitioners of her era, known for treating patients that other doctors had given up on. But what made her case interesting was the complete absence of information about her life before arriving in Oregon. Hernandez opened the first box and found what appeared to be a personal journal, its leather binding cracked with age but the pages still readable. As she began to read, her expression shifted from casual curiosity to focused attention, then to something approaching disbelief. The journal documented the life of someone who claimed to have been responsible for the largest mass poisoning in American history. Page after page described the systematic elimination of California's cotton kings in 1852, written in the careful handwriting of someone who had clearly been educated despite claiming to have been born into slavery. "The guilt never leaves," read one entry dated 1867. "I tell myself that each life I save now balances one that I took then, but mathematics cannot solve moral equations. I eliminated evil men, but I also created orphans and widows. Justice and revenge are not synonymous, though they often wear similar faces." As Hernandez continued reading, she realized she was holding one of the most significant historical documents ever discovered in the Pacific Northwest. The journal provided detailed information about an event that historians had debated for over 150 years, offering insights into the personal motivations and psychological aftermath of an act that had helped destabilize the plantation system in California. But more importantly, the journal revealed how someone who had committed mass murder had transformed herself into a healer, spending 4 decades trying to balance the scales through medical service. It was a story of redemption that complicated simple narratives about good and evil, justice and revenge. Modern historians have come to understand that the Cotton King's poisoning was far more significant than previous generations realized. The elimination of California's plantation leadership in 1852 created a power vacuum that accelerated the territory's transition to free labor agriculture, contributing to the economic and political tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The psychological impact was equally important. News of the poisoning spread throughout the American slave states, creating paranoia among plantation owners who suddenly realized that their human property possessed the intelligence and capability to strike back in ways they had never imagined. This fear led to increased security measures that made the plantation system more expensive and less efficient, hastening its economic decline. But perhaps most significantly, the story became legend among enslaved communities throughout the American South and West. The tale of a woman who had eliminated 100 oppressors in a single week provided hope and inspiration to people who had been taught that resistance was futile. It demonstrated that individual action, carefully planned and courageously executed, could challenge even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Dr. Hernandez's discovery prompted a new wave of research into the poisoning and its aftermath. Investigators used modern forensic techniques to analyze the amber bottle found in Catherine Thornfield's effects, confirming that it had once contained oleander extract in concentrations that would have been lethal in small doses. Chemical analysis of documents from the journal revealed that the same hands that had written about mixing poison had later written prescriptions for medicines that saved lives. The transformation from killer to healer was documented not just in words, but in the physical evidence of someone who had completely redirected her knowledge and skills toward different purposes. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.